The war may have ended, but its legacy lingered, haunting the streets of post-war Japan. Abandoned warehouses, once brimming with artillery shells, rifles, and explosives, sat idle, tire contents decaying and forgotten. The remnants of a powerful military machine lay scattered across the country, a danger to those who dared approach. As Japans fragile Infrastruktur struggled to rebuild, the task of neutralizing these deadly stockpiles became an overwhelming, hazardous battle. This was aber fought not with soldiers, but with the remnants of destruction itself, with each forgotten weapon a ticking time bomb waiting to be dismantled or forgotten forever. The war had ended, yet silence did not bring peace. Across the Japanese home islands, in the shattered warehouses of Hiroshima, Nagoya, and Osaka, rows upon rows of weapons lay untouched, cold, and almost forgotten. Artillery shells, thousands of rifles, stockpiles of grenades, boxes of ammunition, all built for a conflict that had concluded before many of them ever left their depots. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the Imperial Japanese Army's arsenal was a problem far beyond mere storage. It was a tangible reminder of an industrial war machine rendered suddenly obsolete, a network of material and human resources with no purpose, yet still demanding attention, fuel, and care. By the summer of 1945, estimates placed Japan's surplus at over 14 million small arms, 1.5 million artillery rounds, and an unknown quantity of chemical munitions, much of it scattered across hundreds of depots and former training grounds. The scale of the stockpiles was staggering not just in quantity, but in geography. Northern Honshu alone contained depots capable of holding 2,000 tons of explosive ordnance. Kyushu's coastal warehouses had been built to supply a projected invasion defense, a defensive network that now sat idle, some depots partially flooded from typhoon season or damaged by incendiary raids. Each warehouse was a combination of risk and opportunity, poorly ventilated, often constructed of wood, and in many cases containing unstable munitions. Logistics officers from the occupying forces quickly realized that immediate intervention was necessary, yet the task was complicated by sheer volume, local infrastructure collapse, and the risk of accidental detonations. Transporting even a fraction of these weapons to central dismantling sites required trucks, manpower, and security, all resources already scarce in a country struggling to feed its population of 72 million. The economic pressure was immediate and relentless. Japan's industrial base had been decimated by targeted bombing campaigns, leaving the nation incapable of processing its own surplus. Steel mills were damaged, energy supplies interrupted, and labor forces depleted. Maintaining the stockpiles was itself a drain. Armed guards were needed to prevent looting, warehouses required repairs, and corrosion and humidity were slowly rendering munitions unsafe. The Japanese Ministry of War, stripped of authority under Allied occupation, issued directives for local garrisons to catalog, stabilize, and, where feasible, consolidate materials. In practice, this meant lists of serial numbers, crude inventories, and the first experimental attempts at controlled destruction. A report from late 1945 noted that nearly 30% of stored artillery shells in central Honshu had begun to deteriorate to the point where handling was considered dangerous. Decisions had to be made quickly: keep, destroy, or abandon. Initial post-war actions were cautious. American and British officers, along with remaining Japanese bureaucrats, established joint teams to survey stockpiles, aiming to avoid accidental explosions while identifying materials suitable for repurposing. Chemical weapons, primarily mustard gas and phosgene, were a priority, given their potential for catastrophic loss of life if mishandled. Sites in Shikoku and the southern islands were cordoned off, and a preliminary program of seawater dumping was discussed as a means of neutralization. By late 1945, roughly 5,000 tons of chemical munitions had been submerged along the coasts under the supervision of naval engineers. Conventional munitions, however, presented a different challenge. Rifles and machine guns, numbering in the millions, could theoretically be converted to civilian use or sold for scrap, but the market was saturated, and the immediate need for cash or reconstruction materials was overshadowed by the sheer hazard these items represented if stored improperly. At the same time, Japan's former military infrastructure faced repurposing or abandonment. Ammunition factories, many located near major rail hubs in Osaka and Sendai, were intact but stripped of skilled technicians. Allied authorities evaluated which facilities could be converted for civilian manufacturing, noting that certain plants had the capacity to produce thousands of tons of fertilizer or industrial chemicals if machinery could be salvaged. Others, particularly specialized ordnance plants, were marked for dismantling. By mid-1946, teams were systematically removing presses, lathes, and chemical reactors. Estimates indicated that over 60% of the industrial equipment used to produce firearms and artillery between 1939 and 1945 would never be reactivated. Those facilities left standing were slowly absorbed into Japan's fragile post-war economy, often stripped for scrap steel to rebuild housing and transportation networks destroyed by the bombing campaigns. Scrapping, however, was not a simple matter. Ammunition required demilitarization. Fuses had to be removed, explosive compounds neutralized, and metal casings separated by type. Small arms were first stripped of components, rifles' wooden stocks were salvaged for furniture, and steel barrels melted down. Heavy artillery and mortars were cut into sections by teams using acetylene torches and portable cranes. The scale of labor was immense. Reports from 1946 indicate that processing one single depot containing 2,000 tons of munitions could tie up over 300 workers for several months, with protective equipment rudimentary and casualties from accidental ignitions a constant concern. At the same time, the cost of operation was high, fuel shortages, rising wages for skilled laborers, and the expense of storage or transportation often exceeded the scrap value of recovered metal. In many cases, it was cheaper to bury or burn ordnance in controlled burns rather than transport it to distant factories for reclamation. Abandonment also emerged as an unintended solution. Remote depots, particularly in northern Hokkaido and parts of Kyushu, were simply left. Tarpaulins rotted, wooden structures collapsed, and rain and snow slowly corroded the weapons within. By 1947, aerial surveys showed hundreds of small sites completely overgrown, their contents largely intact but deteriorating. Looting by civilians, often motivated by hunger or the desire to fashion crude tools, became a sporadic hazard, though large-scale recovery operations were discouraged by occupation authorities. At some coastal sites, heavy artillery pieces were pushed into rivers or shallow bays to reduce inventory, creating underwater munitions hazards that would persist for decades. Each decision reflected a balance between material recovery, public safety, and the limits of Japan's collapsing infrastructure. Meanwhile, international considerations influenced post-war policy. Allied forces were acutely aware that the presence of such vast stockpiles posed a potential risk to regional stability if left unmonitored. Intelligence reports documented the locations and approximate tonnages of remaining weapons, guiding occupation forces in prioritizing removal. Chemical and biological weapons were destroyed first, conventional munitions next, and small arms were catalogued for potential redistribution or controlled demolition. The process was slow and methodical, constrained by both manpower and the pressing needs of the civilian population. In urban areas, warehouses once brimming with rifles and machine guns were gradually converted into housing, schools, or municipal storage, but the transformation often lagged behind necessity. The human element, soldiers, engineers, laborers, and local officials, was stretched thin, each individual navigating the intersection of legal authority, occupational oversight, and sheer physical hazard. Economic realities further dictated outcomes. Post-war Japan faced inflation, rationing, and a population in urgent need of employment. Salvage operations for metals and munitions offered one of the few available sources of income, yet the pace of recovery remained uneven. Coastal dumping of artillery shells and chemical munitions, while effective in neutralization, imposed long-term ecological and logistical costs. Steel rails removed from disused military factories fed reconstruction projects, yet reports indicated that much of the metal was contaminated or corroded, reducing its value. The tension between immediate utility and long-term consequences framed every decision: leave it, dismantle it, or repurpose it. Amid this slow, bureaucratic, and hazardous process, the Japanese population confronted the physical reminders of their recent mobilization. Streets and fields were littered with inert grenades, artillery shells, and unexploded ordnance. Warehouses stood empty, their inventory gone but the scars of war evident in cracked floors and blackened beams. Children sometimes found small arms abandoned at the edges of villages, prompting local authorities to organize retrieval efforts. In some regions, entire communities were engaged in cataloging, reporting, or dismantling former army depots. The war's end had not brought closure. It had created a new logistical and economic battlefield, one measured not in miles or strategic positions, but in tons of munitions, kilometers of rail, and months of labor. By 1947, a clearer pattern was emerging, though the final outcomes remained uncertain. Large-scale scrapping operations had begun to dominate in central and southern Japan, while northern depots were often left untouched, subject to weathering and natural decay. Controlled burns, underwater dumping, and systematic dismantling coexisted uneasily, producing a patchwork of solutions rather than a comprehensive resolution. The Imperial Japanese Army's weapons, once a symbol of power, now existed in limbo, materially present yet functionally inert, simultaneously a hazard and a resource. Reports from occupation authorities indicated that more than 40% of small arms had been processed or destroyed by mid-1947, yet nearly 60% remained scattered, vulnerable, and in many cases forgotten. Each site held potential danger. Each ton of metal represented both an opportunity for reconstruction and a reminder of what had been mobilized and lost. It was in this environment, marked by slow bureaucratic motion, pressing economic need, and lingering uncertainty, that the post-war story of Japan's military stockpiles continued. Decisions made in warehouses and coastal depots shaped the immediate recovery of the nation, but they also left a lingering question. How does a society responsibly handle the remnants of its own vast industrialized violence? The answers were not yet fully written, and the processes that would determine the ultimate fate of millions of weapons were only beginning to take shape. As Japan slowly began to recover from its wartime devastation, the full scope of its military surplus became a pressing issue. The depots and abandoned stockpiles dotted across the country were no longer merely a post-war inconvenience. They were a danger that could not be ignored. While much of the destruction had been controlled in the immediate aftermath, the slow burn of neglect had transformed these arsenals into a constant threat, both to the public and to the ongoing process of rebuilding. In early 1948, the Allied occupation authorities began to realize the sheer scale of what had been left behind. Some areas, especially in the far northern reaches of Hokkaido and remote Kyushu, had yet to be touched. The lack of manpower and resources meant that many of these regions, remote and abandoned, were left to their own devices. There were reports of stray artillery shells being unearthed by farmers, abandoned bombs discovered in collapsed buildings, and even entire bunkers still packed with explosives, waiting to be disturbed by the unwitting hand of a civilian. By late 1948, the disposal of leftover military material became a coordinated international effort, with Japan's post-war government working alongside American and British forces. The decision to move forward with large-scale reclamation and destruction was shaped by the economic reality of post-war Japan. The nation had no choice but to focus on rebuilding its civilian infrastructure, and the presence of surplus military stockpiles was a drain on resources that could otherwise be directed toward more immediate needs, such as food, housing, and transportation. Even if the stockpiles were valuable in theory, potentially recoverable as scrap metal or repurposed in other ways, there was simply no economic incentive to continue investing in the processing of items that had no practical use. Scrap recovery had been a modest success in some regions, but the sheer volume and danger of the materials meant that it was a time-consuming and costly endeavor. By 1949, reports of accidents were becoming increasingly frequent. Accidental detonations, the most common cause of death among civilians in rural areas, served as a grim reminder of the dangers posed by the remnants of war. For the most part, the stockpiles had not been properly monitored in the years following the surrender. Only when a particularly severe explosion killed several workers at a former military depot in Nagoya in early 1950 did the full gravity of the situation finally come to light. The Japanese government, now under pressure from the Allies, moved to accelerate the cleanup effort. Large-scale disposal operations were initiated, utilizing both Japanese and foreign experts in ordnance disposal and demolition. At the same time, the Japanese government also began to take more direct control over the process. A dedicated branch of the Ministry of Finance was tasked with overseeing the destruction of the surplus. They devised a plan to destroy large quantities of weapons at sea, utilizing both controlled demolition and offshore incineration to dispose of hazardous materials. The vast majority of the remaining chemical weapons were neutralized this way, though an estimated 5,000 tons were still unaccounted for by the end of the decade, lost in the depths of the Pacific. The process was painstakingly slow and dangerous. Many of the chemicals had degraded over time, causing additional risks during their disposal. In some areas, civilians reported strange smells and skin rashes near former military zones, indicative of improper handling or mishandling of volatile substances. Simultaneously, small arms were shipped out of the country by the thousands. Japan's military surpluses, including millions of rifles, machine guns, and ammunition, were either destroyed or sold to international buyers. The United States, which was in the process of stabilizing its post-war occupation of Japan, took advantage of the situation, acquiring significant quantities of small arms for use in its own military operations in Korea. By the early 1950s, many of the remaining weapons, especially those in usable condition, were sold through unofficial channels, funneled through various post-war black markets, or sold outright to military groups in Southeast Asia. By 1952, the formal occupation of Japan was officially over. With the Treaty of Peace and Japan's renunciation of war as a means of settling international disputes, the last remnants of the Imperial Japanese Army's wartime stockpiles were either destroyed or repurposed. But the environmental impact of the war's legacy would be felt for decades to come. Though large quantities of weapons were disposed of, the physical scars of the war remained, particularly in the regions closest to former military installations. Bombs left in shallow waters continued to present a danger to fishing boats, and the environmental damage caused by the destruction of chemical munitions remained a lingering concern for coastal communities. It was clear by the mid-1950s that Japan had made significant strides in disarming its war machinery, yet the question of what to do with the remaining stockpiles continued to haunt the post-war landscape. Many of the problems left by the war were never fully resolved. The economic, environmental, and human costs of dealing with the weapons stockpiles were immense, and the aftermath of these efforts was far from perfect. 4 years after, there were occasional discoveries of weapons caches, ammunition buried deep in the earth, artillery shells stuck in the mud of former war zones, and old bunkers revealing their deadly contents long after the war had ended. By the early 1960s, Japan's effort to clean up and move beyond its war legacy was largely complete. The depots were mostly emptied, the factories repurposed, and the coastal zones cleared of dangerous remnants. Yet the weight of the past lingered in the form of hazardous sites, unexploded ordnance, and memories of the vast machinery of war that once dominated the islands.